Hello and welcome to Fender Trash. Is the title a reference to my opinions, my drawing skills, or both? That's for you to decide. So housing has been out for a few months now, in some capacity or other, but before a single person was able to officially claim their first plot, I was already seeing speculation and a desire for more neighborhoods, with the most popular candidate being one set in Northrend or Silvermoon. Now of course, there's nothing wrong with speculation, and it's very much human nature. Heck, one of the most frequent discussions during BFA was what other allied races were still coming, since they were throwing them at us like crazy. But I also think a lot of players haven't fully considered the ramifications of more neighborhoods, and it almost feels dismissive of the truly amazing neighborhoods we've already received in Founders Point and Razorwind Shores, especially Razorwind Shores. But at any rate, Blizzard is undoubtedly going to expand upon neighborhoods in the future, and I believe there are three primary ways for them to do this. I will cover each of them in turn, and then discuss what I think the best approach to it all is. The first strategy they can take is to simply add more plots. Already, as I mentioned in my initial plot commentary videos, there are approximately 4 areas per neighborhood that feel very clearly designed to fit a house, but which are instead represented by NPCs and construction assets. And some of these feel like they'd be very prime locations, such as an actual second plot with a good view of the Four Sisters waterfalls in Razorwind, or a third plot overlooking Crescent Cove in Founders Point. It almost baffles the mind that these weren't just implemented as actual plots in the first place. The 55 current plots per neighborhood are wonderful and all, but I see no significance behind the number itself, and 59 would have fit just as well. Perhaps they actually were running into processing limits beyond 55, similar to how they were hesitant to give us an outside decor budget of more than 200 at first. Perhaps they left them for some other purpose, such as the alluded to guild halls or other public functions. Perhaps they simply like the visual indicator that these neighborhoods are still being developed in a lore sense. Whatever the reason may be, this is obviously the easiest way for Blizzard to add more places for us to live. Heck, for certain guilds that are trying to house just over 55 people, it probably sounds amazing to get just those few extra plots so you don't need 2 separate subdivisions. Though you could obviously extend that logic any number of times. Aside from those niche cases and for people who just really want those specific areas for their house, I can't imagine that making them official plots at this point would generate much hype at all. Except that Four Sisters plot, obviously. So while the easiest to implement, I also view it as the least likely, because of the limited returns it would provide in player excitement. Still, we'll have to see. The second approach would be, as seems to be most popularly requested, to add completely new neighborhood zones. It's a simple enough concept, though arguably the most intensive workload for Blizzard. Not as hard as these first two in all likelihood, simply because Blizzard now has a template for what just such a zone requires, and the experience to make it more quickly. But still, it's no small task by any means. As mentioned earlier, a Silvermoon/Quel'Thalas themed neighborhood and a Northrend themed neighborhood are the most consistently put forth suggestions, due to both the aesthetic appeal that both regions have for many players, and the fact that Midnight and the Last Titan take place in those environments. However, let's not forget that housing as a whole is considered a Midnight feature. So even if we had early access to them, we technically got 2 neighborhoods in Midnight already, and I'm very doubtful that Blizz wants to rush out a third before we've even properly settled in. I think a Northrend neighborhood is significantly more likely, though, in my opinion, that'd still be entirely too soon. Because for as exciting as the idea of more neighborhood zones is, I think this option is also the one most fraught with potential downsides. Foremost among them is that the more neighborhoods there are, the less time you're likely to spend in any given one. Heck, I already spend fairly minimal time in my Founders Point neighborhood compared to my Razorwind one. Yes, that's also because my friends are in Razorwind, but even if my time in them was even, that time would diminish with each additional zone. And when players start spending less time in any given zone, those zones each start to feel less and less alive. Heck, that's why layers for open world zones were originally added all those years ago, so that older and more obscure zones didn't become absolute ghost towns. There's also the matter of endeavors, which are tied to each specific neighborhood. Now, thus far, my neighborhoods have never even come close to not completing their endeavors. And obviously, the required participation is something that Blizzard has the full capacity to change at any moment, but the same principle is at play here. The more houses and neighborhoods you have, the more divided your attention is going to be. Now, there is a way to mitigate these problems. add more zones, but keep us restricted to just 2 houses. This would still leave the player base as a whole more spread out, but at the very least, players who stay in the current zones would not be dividing their attention further. However, I don't think this limitation would be likely to be implemented anyway. If you add a new zone to live in, players are going to want to check it out, and they aren't going to want to abandon their old plot and zone to do so, even if they could copy over the actual design of their house. Many would be willing to, of course, but it'd be a massive pain point that the devs would rather avoid altogether. So while I do think we'll eventually get more than just our current 2 zones, I don't think it'll be as many or as quickly as the player base seems to desire. Nor should it be, if you ask me. The third approach, and one that I happen to find quite fun, is to expand the current neighborhood zones. Similar to the first tactic we covered, this one would see the implementation of more plots into Founders Point and Razorwind Shores. The difference is that this point would have us expanding, primarily northward, into what are currently the pretty much untouched northern halves of each island, which would also put the city portals at the center of each island. This approach would pretty much necessitate some terraforming to occur, but I don't think anyone would be too broken up by losing what's currently there. I mean, the lakes above Four Sisters are kind of nice, but how often are you actually hanging out there? So what would be the draw of this approach? Well, seeing as we're adding new plots to what is essentially unexplored land, Blizz can be creative with what they want this land to actually be in the long-term permanent sense, by which I ultimately mean more biomes, or burrows, or whatever you want to call them. Founders Point feels great. If you're a human, Worgen, Kultiran, and arguably a dwarf if you're in Stonevale Ridge. Beyond that, you start to stretch how at home characters of different races actually feel there. Because remember, it's conceptually a mashup of Elwyn Forest, Westfall, and Duskwood. Now, Razorwind Shores does fare better, being a great fit for orcs, trolls, blood elves, Nightborn, Tauren, and goblins if you're focusing on the island vibes and don't care as much about the city vibes. Heck, Volpera can even fit well in the Durotar-esque plots. But what about the other races? Heck, a very common complaint is that Forsaken players need to have a house in Founders Point's Broomwood Hollow to have a spooky setting. I would suggest at least 2 new biomes in each neighborhood. I think building up from Stonevale Ridge in northeastern Founders Point, we could have some more mountainous and even snowy plots that would appeal to players with those preferences, and feel like more fitting homes for dwarves and gnomes. And to the northwest, or well, central west I suppose, I would introduce a biome similar to Azure Mist Isle, as it would be a reasonable transition from the forests of the central region and from the cooler, beachier Outer Banks biome. It could also potentially give Night Elves a more fitting home, as an Azure Mist style wooded area is more reminiscent of a Kalimdor forest than any currently available biomes. Shifting over to Razorwind, I think a very sensible change would be to make the area north of Cragthorn Highlands into a spookier, Tirisfal-like forest, as that's clearly what the island is in most desperate need of. As long as the transition is handled well, I don't think it would spoil the beauty of Cragthorn at all, provided any blight doesn't flow downstream, and I'd ultimately appreciate the variety. As for the northwest part of the island, well, I think we actually have some flexibility with what could go there. I suppose if we want snow, it makes sense to have a winter-spring inspired area in the mountains. It'd certainly fit for orcs, Meghar, and Greenskin, but honestly, there isn't really another hole to fill. Maybe give us some volcanic areas just for the awesome factor? I mean, we have the hot springs, so there's reason to suspect that things are pretty active down there. I know there's a high demand for an Eversong-looking biome, but honestly, I think the Ajara biome fills that need more than adequately, and would rather have more diversity be added instead. Anyway, this approach does have its own pros and cons. To its advantage, it would keep players in the existing zones and have a degree of hype due to the new visuals, although less hype than an entirely new zone. However, it would have to add a good deal of plots, probably 15 to 20 in each, which is great for bustling neighborhoods, but for anything not near full capacity, just means that the same amount of people spread over a wider area, which means less traffic and a bit of a sense of less activity. I mean, the players are still there, but the chances of stumbling across them just decreases. It's not a colossal concern, but it isn't one that should be hand-waved either. I ultimately consider it the middle ground tactic between approaches 1 and 2, both in terms of how much interest it would generate and how risky it is. So, what approach, or set of approaches, do I think Blizzard should take? Well, a little bit of all three, I think. The extra pre-existing plots would change very little, but the fact that they're just sitting there is honestly a bit frustrating. Just open them up, unless you're saving them for something. My personal favorite form of expanding would be the extra biomes, as I want each faction's island to feel complete and representative. And there's just all that unused space. As the middle ground approach, I think it's the best compromise, but I also am extremely confident Blizz will eventually want to drum up anticipation for an entirely new zone. It's going to happen, and I'm not even opposed to it. It just needs to be done very sparingly. Honestly, I think one new zone in the last Titan at earliest, but preferably later, is about the most they should do. Give us all a third house and have the neighborhood have more faction agnostic design. Heck, put some of it underground. That'd be a twist. But I'd be very hesitant to add any more zones beyond that, at least for quite some time. So, do you have a preference or disagree with my conclusions? Or heck, maybe there's a fourth approach that I didn't even think of. Let me know. For this week's drawing, well, I decided on the zone first, that being Tirisfal Glades, since, as you probably gathered, a Tirisfal biome north of Cragthorn Highlands is the addition that just makes the most sense to me. And yeah, as I said in my Zones of Eastern Kingdoms video, Tirisfal is spooky, but it feels very homey. I mean, it's a vanilla starting zone, of course it does. Even with all the corpses and ghosts running around, there's enough simplicity and I guess nostalgia here to make you just feel at home. Yet another argument in my favor. And I decided to draw Lillian Voss, since A, her storyline started out here, and B, she's probably the most prominent Forsaken character that I haven't drawn yet, and I suspect my opinion on Lillian is probably an unpopular one. A lot of players really clung to her from BFA onwards, by sheer virtue of her not being Kalia. Lillian both looked like a normal undead, and had certainly gone through the experience of being rejected by her former loved ones. But also, and you may not remember this nowadays, but Lillian joining the Horde kinda came out of nowhere. She was a completely free agent in MoP. In Legion, she was a rogue follower for Horde characters specifically, but none of the story involving her actually involves the Horde. And then by BFA, she's sort of just a full-fledged member, following orders for the war campaign, sneaking around Kultiris, and raising new Forsakens such as Amalia Stone and Thomas Selling. And it just felt very jarring. In a very short time frame, she went from free agent to one of the leaders of the Forsaken. Yes, she's obviously nowhere as offensive as Kalia, but she could have been developed a lot better, and I feel like a lot of players just give her a free pass. But I do recognize I'm probably being unfair to her by sheer virtue of her being one of Sylvanas' replacements. So, you know, she's never going to be one of my favorite characters, but she's quite alright, and I was really satisfied with how this drawing came out, particularly Voss herself and the cobblestones. But that is everything I have for this video, so thank you very much for watching, and I will catch you next week. Bye bye.